Good afternoon, everybody. We would like to ask to record the proceedings, which will then be made available to everybody at a later stage on the ICR YouTube channel and other online platforms. My name is Nhlanhla Cyril Mbatha. I'm the hosting chair for the webinar this afternoon. Thank you for making the time to join this ICR webinar on such an important research and policy discussion. This is around the socio-economic challenges of shelter and accommodation for the vulnerable groups like the working class, the poor, local and foreign migrants, and associated public policies in dealing with those challenges. Although the focus is on a specific case focusing on Johannesburg in South Africa, the challenges are at a national level and as well as at a global level. Some of the questions that we agreed with our guest speaker that might make for a great discussion around these challenges include the following. What is the long-term solution to urban housing shortages other than relying on eviction, relocation, and temporary emergency accommodation? What do terms like emergency and temporary mean in reality when most settlements have become long-term? What are the practical and political obstacles to expanding inner city affordable accommodation? In the absence of a clear legal definition of home, how should we understand the social, emotional, and political meanings of the term home? These are psychologically provoking questions for many who live their lives without shelter, never mind home. The ICR is very excited to host this discussion, which is of a global relevance and fits in well with one of our research focus areas on human and economic development. And currently the ICR's research focus is on the following areas: environmental resources management, focusing on land and water reform policies, education and skills development, particularly technical skills training for the youth, the human and economic development area, focusing on quality of life and urban-rural development challenges, like the one discussion we are having today. Lastly, we have a research focus area on cross-border trade in Africa with particular interest on AGOA, the EPAS, relationships between Africa and the EU. And we also currently undertaking research that is focused on the new continental free trade area agreement. So those are currently our areas. We invite and welcome discussions for possible collaborations and partnerships on these areas all the time at the ICR. Please visit our ICR webpage, ru.ac.za/ICR for details. I would like to thank today's guest and discussants who are Dr. Matthew Wilhelm-Solomon and our two discussants or respondents, Ms. Mpho Raboeane and Ms. Meloney van Eck. Matthew. Dr. Matthew Wilhelm-Solomon is an urban and medical anthropologist with a particular interest in nonfiction narrative. In the anthropology department at Wits University, he teaches the second-year course, Life Worlds of the City, and the postgraduate ethnographic writing and analysis courses. Matthew holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford, which was on ethnographic study on HIV and AIDS treatment programs to displaced communities in northern Uganda. His research since 2011 has focused on themes of unlawful occupation, eviction, social movements, migration, health access, and religion in Johannesburg. He's also an associate researcher of the Migration and Health Program Southern Africa. Matthew has published widely in South Africa and international journals, including Medical Anthropology, Current Anthropology, Cultural Anthropology, Critical African Studies, and the African Cities Reader, and a number of newspapers and journalistic publications, including the Mail and Guardian, the Daily Maverick, and the New Frame. He is the lead editor of the book, Roots and Rights to the City, Mobility, Diversity, and Religion Space in Johannesburg. Palgrave Macmillan, 2016. He is a contributing co-editor to Effective Trajectories, Religion and Emotion in African Cityscapes, Duke University Press, 2020. At present, he is completing a nonfiction narrative book on unlawful occupations and evictions in Johannesburg. Matthew lives between South Africa and Brazil, and in his free time is a fan of jazz, yoga, football, and literature. Matthew is also a long-time friend of mine whom I met for the first time at Rhodes University in a politics class. Mpho. Ms. Mpho Raboeane holds a Bachelor of Commerce degree in Politics, Philosophy, and Economics, and an LLB degree from the University of Cape Town. She completed her articles with the Legal Resources Center in 2017 and was a Mbatha Justice Fellow. Mpho is currently an attorney at the Urban Land Justice Organization called Ndifuna Ukwazi and leads their Resisting Evictions and Displacement Task Team. The organization promotes the realization of constitutional rights and social justice through legal research and organizing support to working class people, communities, and social movements. The organization works to advance urban land justice, and that is the protection and promotion of access to affordable, well-located housing in Cape Town, building inclusive and sustainable mixed use and mixed income communities, and supporting tenant rights and security of tenure in both private and public housing. Ndifuna Ukwazi also specializes in community-based social auditing of service delivery, access to information and procurement monitoring at the local government level, budget analysis and advocacy, and activist education. Meloney. Ms. Meloney van Eck is currently an executive leading strategic support at the Housing Development Agency, HDA. She's a seasoned administrator in human settlements with immense experience in the public sector, with her career spanning over 2 decades in various executive roles. Some of Meloney's notable roles include serving as Chief of Staff in departments such as the National Human Settlements, National Arts and Culture, Economic Development, Agriculture and Rural Development in Gauteng Province. Meloney has also served as Deputy Director General in Human Settlements, Gauteng Province, responsible for regional coordination and program management. Meloney is a graduate of the Tshwane University of Technology and the University of Pretoria, amongst other institutions. She's currently advancing her business studies with the Southern Business College. Colleagues, I'm really pleased to welcome you and thank you for allowing us the opportunity to hear about your work and your inputs into this very important discussion. To everybody in the audience, we welcome you. Some of the process and etiquette outlined just now. The presentation of about 25 minutes will be done by Dr. Matthew Wilhelm-Solomon. This will immediately be followed by the responses, first from Ms. Mpho Raboeane and then Ms. Meloney van Eck. This will then be followed by a discussion time with questions and comments from everybody in the audience. Throughout the main presentation, please do remember the main presentation as well as the responses. Please do remember to write down your questions and comments in the Q&A box on your screens. Please do not use the chat because it's difficult for us to trace the questions or comments when they are there. Remember to use the Q&A box. Depending on the number of questions and level of clarity, I will either read out the questions or ask the persons who asked the questions or made the comment to state their questions themselves through audio. Do not worry, we will not ask you to be put on video. So there's no pressure whatsoever about your visual background. We just only need your voice and thoughts. The discussion with comments, questions, and answers will take us to the end of the webinar, which we plan to be about 1 hour 45 minutes. So without further wasting of any time, I would like to ask Matthew to take over on your presentation. Matthew?
So can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay. So thanks so much, Nhlanhla, and thanks to Jamie and Tamron, the ICR team, for making this happen. And it's nice to connect back to Grahamstown after 20 years, albeit through Brazil. So time is short, so I'm going to get straight into it. I just wanted to note something which I woke up to this morning. This was the first piece of news that I read this morning, which is 9 die in a fire, several injured after jumping from burning building in Johannesburg CBD. The building was in, as far as I could see, in Jeppe, near the CBD and near my family home in Kensington. I've never visited it, though I've seen it several times, but from what I can see, it seems to be the type of building which is characteristic of many in the cities, of essentially informal settlements inside of urban structures. And the kind of tragedy of this event, I'm flagging it twofold, because this event is part of a recurring pattern, and I really encourage, if any media here or other researchers, to look into it and really understand this dynamic. One, because too often in the city, Black poor residents, their deaths are barely reported, and things like this are just forgotten. Second, this is part of a recurring pattern, most notably in 2017, where there was a large fire at Cape York in which 7 people were killed. And it speaks to a key issue, which is what I'll speak about today, is really the lack of a decent accommodation for low-income Black workers, informal workers, traders, the unemployed, both South African and foreign national in inner city Johannesburg. And the lack of basic services, water, electricity, sanitation, all of these which contribute to creating the conditions for fire, because if people are using generators, paraffin lamps, Primus, stoves, all of these, and don't have access to water, produce very high-risk environments. Now it's very easy to blame the residents and say, well, why are you living in these conditions? But frequently the residents of these spaces have nowhere else to go. They're in the city looking for work or because of access to informal employment, and cannot enter even so-called social or affordable housing. And so I just want to flag this as the research I'm speaking to really ended in 2019. I've tracked a bit what happened during COVID, but it's still a very present issue. And as Nhlanhla said, I've been doing research around these issues since 2011. So I'll speak about a longer term perspective. I'm going to draw from a paper I published called The City Otherwise, which is published in Cultural Anthropology, and it's open access. It was shared with a link. But also I've adapted it a bit. And I'll speak briefly to the case studies, but if anyone's interested, they can follow up with the written paper. So I'm going to speak to a key issue, which is that the issue of unlawful occupations and emergency accommodation question the meanings of home in the post-apartheid city, but also globally the contradictions between private property and socio-economic rights. Now, often the solution to the housing in Johannesburg is being placed on the private sector. And of course, the private sector can play a role, but essentially in the post-apartheid era, the private sector has not catered for very low income urban rental accommodation. As I'm sure Meloney will speak to, the state has built over 3 million houses through RDP and breaking new ground. And yet many of the houses have been on urban peripheries, former informal settlements, and haven't really addressed the issue of inner city accommodation, and populations living in the inner cities. So that's the basic context. When we speak about housing and homes, the framing is really the Constitution. In Section 26 of the Constitution, which says everyone has the right to have access to adequate housing. And it must be clear that constitutional jurisprudence has made clear that everyone means everyone, not just South African citizens. The state must take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to achieve the progressive realization of this right. And no one may be evicted from their home or have their home demolished without an order of the court, after considering all of the relevant circumstances. So, I mean, there's other laws like PI Act and a whole sequence of jurisprudence around these issues, which I can't go into here. But what I wish to indicate in terms of the question of what a home means is this kind of paradox that emerges within constitutional law, which is the paradox of home and homelessness. So the right to access affordable housing is one of progressive realization. It's not immediately enforceable. The state has to take measures to work towards that within available resources. In contrast, the right to prevent evictions that lead to homelessness is immediately enforceable, in the sense is that one can have a court order protecting one against eviction that leads to homelessness. So the question of what a home is or not also then has significant legal consequences and has been an issue that's been placed in a number of cases. I can't go into this in depth here, but I'll refer you to two articles, one by Tim Fish-Hodgson, who did a briefing note for SERI, which is available online, where he writes, despite the absence of a legal definition of home, homeless, or homelessness, the law acknowledges that having a home and protecting yourself against homelessness is a very important human right, central to the protection of human dignity. And this is really central to understanding what we mean by home in the constitutional sense, is that the court cases have revolved around not just home as in a physical structure and shelter, but also about human dignity and the capacity of having spaces of intimacy, care, protection, and so on. And I think this element should be very important in shaping what we mean when we speak of home. It's not simply the physical structures, it's the forms of social relationships that those physical structures enable. Jeremy Phillips in Daily Maverick also wrote a very interesting piece about redefining the meaning of home as a potential solution for South Africa's unlawful eviction crisis. And he was writing particularly about evictions of informal settlements in the Cape, and how the issue of whether an immediately unoccupied shack is considered a home has really immediate implications for whether that can be evicted or not. And I think Mpho will speak a lot more about that, but she's been involved in the anti-eviction movements in the Cape during COVID. But in the paper, I introduce a concept which I call the deferred emergency. Now, the deferred emergency entails the indefinite deferral of an emergency situation framed around both the juridical and infrastructural form of temporary emergency accommodation, which is no legally defined endpoint. Now, the meaning of this concept will become clearer when I read the case studies, but in essence, it speaks to this paradox that one can protect against evictions, but you don't necessarily have the immediate right to stable housing. So temporary emergency accommodation has become the de facto legal and policy solution. And this has a long history in South Africa, going back over, well, very long term, but also in particular in South African constitutional law since Grootboom 2 decades ago. And in essence, so those evicted don't have to be placed in temporary emergency accommodation, but because without adequate low-cost housing schemes, many of those in TEA then don't have access to housing outside of, or still can't afford. So what's happened in Joburg, but also elsewhere in the Cape and I think KZN, has been that TEA sites have become de facto long-term settlements. In Johannesburg, we have some TEA sites where residents have been living for over a decade. And the other key issue is that the shortage of TE means that it cannot be a solution for the long-term housing shortages in crisis. And yet, in particular in inner city Johannesburg, other solutions haven't been looked at, which is one, looking at in situ upgrading existing occupations for residents which are there. And this, I'm hoping Meloney can speak to a bit, because it's why the informal settlement upgrading program, which has been applied to other informal settlements, isn't being applied in inner city areas, just because those informal settlements are in multi-story inner city buildings. And so you have the condition where you have, in Johannesburg at least, tens of thousands of residents living without basic services, often with no power or forced into unlawful connections. And even now with TEA, there's been contestations about the meaning of TEA, and that's a case study I'll speak to. Now, what can anthropology offer? I'm not an architect, I'm not a policy expert, but what I can offer is speaking over long term to the experiences of those living in inner city occupations, you know, as a white writer and male. I can't represent, but I write with a sense of solidarity and in conversation with those living in occupations. And now an anthropological conception of home in a more traditional sense, as Susan and Michael White and Jennifer Twabazi write about Uganda, often evokes a sense of belonging, a place, to a place and family members, an enduring link to a locality, to living and dead kinsfolk. A house, in contrast to a home, is a shelter, a place of accommodation that can be rented or borrowed. It does not have the same necessary connection to kinship, descent, and land. However, in urban environments with highly mobile populations and where social ties are very fluid, a distinction between house and home is not so clear. Many live in a condition of limbo, temporariness, without any clear legal rights. And many migrants to the city, cross-border migrants, but also the majority of migration into Johannesburg is from other areas of South Africa, often feel that their space in the city is not a home, not stable, is temporary, and look towards the spaces of migration as home. And we need to think about the meanings of that, why even in the post-apartheid era, Johannesburg is not considered a home, or the infrastructure is not there to really make the home for many Black migrants into the city in residence. So just a note on unlawful occupation. So the term, often in the media and policy, they refer to as hijacked buildings, which is a very derogatory and often misleading term, indicating a kind of formal criminal seizure. Now, I'm not denying that there are criminal gangs that operate in some of these spaces, but or issues of title deed fraud, there are. But as an explanation for the structural reasons for this, it's woefully inadequate. And the majority of cases I've come across are not spaces that have been occupied by criminal syndicates. They are spaces that have often once been formally rented and have fallen into dereliction. Sometimes unscrupulous caretakers start collecting illicit rent, or they've been slowly occupied, industrial spaces, old warehouses, and so on. And sometimes there's unlawful rentals, sometimes there's just occupation, sometimes they traded on parallel markets. And so the language of hijacked buildings is very damaging, because it veils what is a very complex social issue and infrastructural and political issue. It also legitimates what we've seen, particularly with Herman Mashaba more recently, but also long-term policy of ANC governments, which is heavy police targeting of these buildings and seeing the issue as a criminal issue, with raids which are more or less useless for crime prevention, but create a spectacle. And this has created a major issue. And one of the key emphases I'm going to make is that it has to be treated as a housing issue, and that inner city residents or occupants need to be engaged and made part of these processes of urban planning. Okay, in terms of numbers, we don't have very precise numbers because of the nature of the unlawfulness. In 2010, Médecins Sans Frontières estimated 50 to 60,000 people lived in inner city slum buildings in conditions lower than international standards for refugee camps in terms of access to sanitation and so on. Census data from 2001 indicated a housing shortage of 30,000 units and about 120,000 people, many of whom could be living in overcrowded or unlawful conditions. Informal documents of City for Johannesburg estimate the number that could be subject to eviction is up to 90,000 people. Yet as of 2018, the city only catered to 1,364 individuals in temporary emergency accommodation facilities available at the time. Subsequently, there have been a few buildings opening up, but the key thing is it's quite clear that TEA cannot begin to cater for this. There has to be a longer term housing, affordable housing solution that caters for residents earning below 3,200 a month. Now, this data is old, and certainly the city and others might have more updated, but that's what I have available to me. Certainly in terms of, the legal situation has changed a lot over the past decades, which I'll speak to a bit, but in terms of provision of basic services, not much has changed. During COVID, the city, and I think effectively, distributed water tanks to many of these buildings. And I think this indicated that if there's a political will, much more can be done. But there hasn't been the political will. This is just from the Rebel group who did a research for what is called ICHIP, Inner City Housing Plan. I can't go into it now, but basically it shows that almost a third of inner city residents can't access the lower rungs of inner city housing. And there was a housing plan ICHIP introduced to expand, but the extent to which that has actually taken place, I think, has been quite limited. Again, evictions continue in spite of constitutional protections, and we have to be clear who's being evicted. It's often families, low-income households, pensioners, students, security workers, and so on. Again, this is Cape York, which burnt down in 2017. There was a court order saying the city needed to improve conditions, which didn't take place. That's a case I've done some research on. I'm not going to speak to it too much today, but it indicates that there are precedents for these types of large-scale disasters. This is where Wembley Stadium, which was the TEA, which was where those from Cape York went, and I imagine from the recent fire will go into similar Canvas 10 situations. This is not representative of all TEA, must be clear. There are buildings which have much better conditions, but these are more or less full as far as I understand, or certainly there's still many on the waiting list to enter that who are still living in unlawful occupations and have existing legal cases. So I'm going to speak, that's a kind of framework. So I'm going to speak a bit to two cases. I'm just going to read a bit, and I can't give the full case histories just because of the limitations of time. So I'm going to read a bit to two case studies. One is of the case study of Saratoga Avenue and eKurhuleni, which were two constitutional court cases, both interconnected, which speak to these issues. And I'm going to read a little bit from my paper here, just an excerpt or two. As I said, you'll have to go in to the paper to see the full case studies. So in October 2017, on a cold spring day, I stood outside the site of 7 Saratoga Avenue, along with Nomsel and Nhlanhla and one of her neighbors. We looked through the barbed wire fence at a courtyard and an abandoned redback carpet factory. This cordoned off derelict space had been my two interlocutors' home before they relocated in 2012. The building was an unlawful occupation, one that was catapulted to the center of post-apartheid housing jurisprudence. We were freed, Nhlanhla told me when I asked what life had been like there in the unlawful occupation. The meanings of her words would only become clear in the context of what to come. The factory had closed in 1999 and had subsequently been unlawfully let by the former caretaker. Then a company called Blue Moonlight purchased the building in 2004 and in 2006 started eviction proceedings. In 2007, police in the Red Ants, the notorious private security, attempted to illegally evict using rubber bullets the 62 adults and 9 children resident at the time. The community, primarily Zulu, had often used the communal courtyard for chatting, cooking, parties, and dances. But on the night of the eviction, Nhlanhla, her granddaughter, and her neighbors spent the night on the street. They had legal representation through CALS, which is at Wits, which blocked the eviction on the basis of it leading to homelessness. This change instigated a period of litigation that would last 5 years until the famous Blue Moonlight case was heard in the Constitutional Court and judgment was given in December 2011. During the case, the city of Johannesburg were tied to the case. Stuart Wilson, one of the leading lawyers acting on behalf of the occupiers in the case, has argued that until the case, the city had relied on the strategy of having private sector actors evict residents of bad buildings, another term for hijacked buildings. Yet the Blue Moonlight case had the key implication, I quote here, the municipality bears the primary responsibility for addressing the housing needs of those persons who after an eviction are unable to find accommodation on their own. So the case is very detailed, and I addressed some of it in the paper, and there's also Wilson and several other papers. But the key issue is that the case said that even though it was a private sector evicted, that the eviction could not go ahead, and that the city had the responsibility to rehome them. They subsequently rehomed the residents into various buildings, but one was an inner city shelter called Ekuteleni, by place, meaning place of rest. Now, in Ekuteleni, the residents found themselves locked out between 8 a.m. and 5:30 p.m. and again after 8 p.m. if they failed to return to the shelter by then. The rooms were gender differentiated, separating even married and long-term couples. The rooms lacked locks and the shelter authorities randomly searched belongings. Social workers took away Nhlanhla's granddaughter, whose mother had passed away and she was the guardian, into foster care, and the shelter did not provide family accommodation. So this was challenged by residents with Cyril, which led to another constitutional court case, which the judgment was given in 2017, which felt the shelter rules to be cruel, condescending, and degrading, and that it had treated grown people like children. Now, Nhlanhla told me of the place, nothing was all right here. There were many tsotis, criminals, nothing was okay. I would like a place to call my home, and it is not safe, this place. So Nhlanhla won the case, which is named after her, and her granddaughter was returned. So there was success, but still remains in this condition of limbo, of living in a space without access to decent accommodation, and yet protected against eviction. And another key, what is very important about Nhlanhla is the judgment also made strongly that even TEA, even if it's not called a home in a kind of colloquial sense, still the rights of dignity apply, the rights of family, the rights of protection. And so TEA is not a solution to escape housing obligations. And in this sense, the legal import on this has set a precedent for what TEA sites should ultimately be. So the implication of Nhlanhla was significant and had knock-on effects on other buildings. Nhlanhla, sorry, how much time do I have left? I'm not sure if I can go into the next case study.
7 minutes, will you be able? 7 minutes?
So I'm just going to briefly speak through just a case study, and again, the full study is in the paper. So that's of Ekuteleni. Another is the station, which is again essentially an inner city Johannesburg building. It's anonymized here with essentially an informal settlement inside of a building. Inside of the station, you have both, it was South African occupants, but now primarily foreign nationals. Many of them are undocumented. There are many a blind community living in the building, and many of blind Zimbabweans are also among the occupants in inner city buildings, because life in Zimbabwe is not feasible because of the kind of socioeconomic collapse. And so networks of these blind, often formed in Zimbabwe through the school system in Zimbabwe, who primarily, even though some have tertiary education, others have school leaving certificates, within South Africa don't have access to livelihoods and so on. And again, this is another population in the building that are living very precariously. And yet this building, the case was suspended pending Nhlanhla, and the eviction case is still ongoing, but the city's report essentially said that, well, the South Africans in the building have access to TEA, but others don't, and are potentially subject to eviction, which is yet to take place. So it again illustrates the kind of, and this case again was waged by a South African pensioner in collaboration with the blind community and others. There are many asylum seekers who face political persecution in Zimbabwe and can't return. The building has had repeated police and deportation raids over the last decade. Many people are deported and simply come back because, and so there's a lot of police corruption where people have to pay to be freed, from detention in the local police station. And as we know, the whole deportation system, with the Mbatha scandal, Ndifuna has run for decades under very brutal conditions towards both labor and migrants. Allegedly has been involved in the corruption around Mbatha, and the whole deportation system, again, along with police raids, is practically useless at dealing with issues of housing, and yet has often been used. And what it does create, the system, is huge space for corruption, the waste of police time and resources. And I think when we think about social resources and public resources, and these are real issues, and I'm not denying that, but that it's not just about the cost of providing housing or temporary shelter, basic services to foreign nationals. There's a huge cost which is being wasted through the deportation system, and huge amounts of police time which are being invested in rounding up undocumented migrants. And so this is again where a housing issue has been treated as a criminal issue. Nonetheless, part of what I'm arguing is that the residents themselves should be engaged in these processes. I don't have all the solutions, but I can, and often it's said, treating people like criminals means the state has a legitimation, both municipality, for not engaging them. But this is an organization I've been doing research with for the past couple of years, the Inner City Federation, which has now been organizing between, I think, over 40 buildings at the moment, working with to form building committees, mobilizing for basic services against evictions, and again, mobilizing for low-cost housing, but again arguing that there has to be basic service provisions for those who are living in very dire conditions. And I think Siyabonga Mahlangu, who's the General Secretary of Inner City Federation, is hopefully here, and he can speak to the work of the organization and to these issues. You don't have to ask me. You can ask him directly. I hope he's managed to join. So this is again a workshop that we did with with Inner City Federation, making flags, and the work with them has been, my own work has been based around ideas of critical pedagogy, which is not just me as the researcher documenting, but also around forms of collaboration, dialogue, workshops. And I think while this is in the academic space, it also opens the possibility for other collaborative spaces with the city, with other organizations to really meaningfully engage in the city populations.
Try and wrap up now then. Please do try and wrap up here.
So I'm just going to then go to a few, can one speak as an anthropologist to kind of policy issues? Well, there are a few things. One, it's about framing what the issue is in the first place. And I think a focus on urban regeneration and housing needs to not just see it as shelter, but about networks of care. Again, the prioritization of low-income rental housing in inner city areas, having an inclusive approach towards rental housing that includes foreign nationals, while it's also sensitive not to exacerbate xenophobic tensions. In the time of the climate crisis, we need to integrate low-cost housing and environmental concerns, green housing. Treating unlawful occupations as primarily a housing and not criminal issue. The occupants as legitimate residents of the city and engaging them in urban planning. And again, I think this needs to be seriously considered, the way in which inner city unlawful occupations can be integrated into the upgrading of informal settlements program or something like that, which provides in situ upgrading and basic services. So thanks very much.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Matthew Wilhelm-Solomon. Thank you, Matthew. Matthew writes and speaks about legal lens in defining home versus shelter or accommodation. And as you speak, Matthew, I'm wondering if the definition of home could also relate to national identity in a historical sense. I'm thinking of pre-1994 rural KZN, for example, where tribal wars sought to use the destruction of houses to change the identity of a nation and its history. And I'm wondering to what degree different lenses of defining home versus shelter filter into our policy formulation around these challenges. What does this all mean for how South Africa identifies itself, for how it defines itself on the continent and globally? What future and history the country wants for its residents in the long term? And those are political questions, I think. So how then do citizens and residents contribute to these political discussions? Are there mechanisms in place for meaningful and frank participations into such? Those are the thoughts that I had there as you were speaking. And I'm wondering and I'm hoping that maybe some of those will be addressed by our respondents as well, especially Meloney. I wonder if Ms. Mpho Raboeane can start uploading her slides. And then we will switch over to Ms. Mpho. Are you ready? Okay, fantastic. I will now ask Ms. Mpho Raboeane to please do respond, and for the audience to please continue writing your questions and comments in the Q&A box. We are receiving some of those. Fantastic. Go ahead, Mpho.
All right, thank you. Let me just get this on slideshow mode. There we go. So my address will primarily focus on the Cape Town context, as that is where I work with my organization. And I just want to take you through the reality that's experienced by the poor and working class communities. These communities have an experience that remains that of an apartheid city. And that is because there is a local authority that is committed to preserving a segregated status quo. This is the reality where the majority of Cape Townians cannot afford to live near centers of economic opportunity, and many rely on state-funded housing opportunities for a place to call home, with the effect of them spending their lifetimes on an obscure housing database. We have long warned that those on the waiting list for public housing, including evictees in transitional relocation areas, have lost hope. More so in a situation where waiting for over 2 decades for the provision of public stock is common. And even where public stock is built, it would invariably be located in the outskirts of the urban center on cheaper land. A damning indication of this is the fact that not a single subsidized home has been built in Cape Town's inner city and surrounds since 1994. And this is despite the fact that Cape Town CBD is the biggest economic node in the metro. This model of housing delivery cements the spatial mismatch between employment and residence, while creating pervasive poverty traps for the populations that find themselves on the peripheries. Many well-located affordable housing developments have failed to materialize under the various iterations of the city's administration. The more recent of these unfulfilled commitments was made in late 2017, and this was for the development of affordable and inclusionary housing opportunities in Salt River, Woodstock, and the inner city precinct. These 11 city-owned sites were to be developed for lower income residents. And the city had estimated that approximately 4,000 beneficiaries with monthly incomes of between 3,500 and 15,000 would move into these units upon completion. To date, very little progress has been made at Pine Road, at Salt River Market, and only the Pickwick Transitional Housing Project, which only houses 19 families, has been completed. So how did we get here? It's trite that the cause of the acute housing shortage lies in apartheid-era policies, which limited African occupation of urban areas and limited their access to economic opportunities. The Western Cape currently has a housing backlog of just under 600,000, with more than 360,000 of that being attributable to the city of Cape Town. By the city's own admission, the current housing backlog seems at this point insurmountable due to their current rate of delivery. Specifically, the city's human settlement strategy denotes an annual requirement for an estimated 50,000 housing opportunities over the next 8 to 10 years in order to address the backlog and new housing demand, whereas public and private sector combined develop less than 20,000 formal new homes on average per year. This dire shortage of affordable housing is in stark contrast to the oversupply of exclusive accommodation in the city center. And testament to this is the fact that pre-pandemic Cape Town was gripped by an affordability crisis. This meant that many working Cape Townians couldn't reasonably afford to buy a home in the city due to the inflated prices that indicated a market failure fueled by speculation in the property market. And even in this context, the city declined to use its legal mechanisms and regulatory tools available to it to ensure that the principle of spatial justice is addressed. The city's spatial planning and land use policies and practices have worked to negate the principle of spatial justice and its tenets of redress, inclusion, tenure security, and by doing so, they actively deny a fair and equitable distribution of space, of socially valued resources, and the opportunities to use them. Instead, we see the city tending to adopt a very short-sighted view of land as solely an economic enterprise. and they do so failing to recognize the social value of land that is inherent in the constitutional prerogative of ensuring equitable access to land. This demonstrated approach is one which objectively values property, which is treated as an asset, over the plight, dignity, and the very lives of those in informal settlements and occupations. Such an approach voids the spirit and promises of the Constitution, more especially its call for substantive equality, which implicitly recognizes that foundational law is not and cannot be neutral with respect to the distribution of social and economic power and of opportunities for people to experience self-realization. And so we've noted with concern the sale and leasing of valuable state land needed to provide housing solutions in the CBD and surrounds. This points to a shirking of the city's legislative duty not to dispose of land, which is a capital asset according to the MFMA and its regulations, needed to provide the minimum level of basic municipal services, which we argue includes housing. We have raised the alarm in instances where valuable land was not only sold off, but was undersold, effectively robbing the public of funds allegedly reserved for service delivery in disadvantaged communities. So is there an alternative? Well, we submit that Reclaim the City's Sissy Gool House, Ahmed Kathrada House, Irene Grootboom House, and others reveal an opportunity as well as a need. The opportunity presented by these occupations is a serious reviewing and redevelopment of vacant, derelict, and underutilized buildings and spaces in the city, particularly in the inner city and surrounds. Notably, the draft human settlement strategy embraces the use of infill sites, stating particular focus will be on infill project delivery, targeting underutilized parcels such as old school sites and consolidating multiple sites. To this end, the city must review its land holdings, target public open spaces as well. These land holdings should be released, accompanied by proactive land use rights to willing micro developers as sites for the development of infill affordable housing. But instead of pursuing this collaborative opportunity created by these houses and occupations, a lived alternative, it's unfortunate that the city, its officials, opt to continue vilifying those who find themselves in these untenable situations. And they do so hiding behind the guise of defending property rights. We've also seen this in the Human Rights Commission case brought against the city of Cape Town, where during lockdown, occupations popped up all across the metro due to the loss of income. As a response, the city failed to follow the procedures set out in the PI Act for legal evictions and used the common law principle of counter-spoliation to unlawfully demolish and evict those who now found themselves without a home. Occupiers should not be approached as political impediments, as undeserving or improper citizens, because we have seen a widespread tendency by local authorities to use this very pandemic and the resulting lockdown as an opportunity to execute unauthorized evictions, demolitions, and the destruction or confiscation of building material, often through gratuitous violence. We've seen law enforcement agencies engaged in what can only be described as tyranny or even a dirty war of sorts. The nature of these evictions speak to a deeper, pervasive disdain for the lives of the poor, majority Black people, whose homes are viewed as vacant structures. Yet these homes are not just a place of shelter. They are a testament to these people's resilience. They are their source of dignity and an attribute to their personhood. Over 2 decades into our constitutional democracy, violent dispossession and dehumanization continue to define the experience of those with precarious tenure. And this has been especially pronounced during this pandemic. The current erasure of people's homes points to a pervasive erasure of their legitimate needs, their vulnerability, and their humanity. And this is in the midst of a housing crisis now exacerbated by the pandemic. So it is a real impossibility in this context to wait in the face of continuing dispossession. And the requirement to wait comes from a state that, despite its insurmountable housing backlog, criminalizes resilience, self-reliance, and the possibility of an alternative. This is the impossibility of being Black and poor in Cape Town. The impossibility of simply waiting passively and indefinitely without a home. And on that note, I'd just like to show you what it is like to have experienced, firstly, losing your home for the effects of lockdown, but also, again, watching your home being demolished again by law enforcement officials, stating that what you call home is in fact not a home, but an invasion of their land rights and an empty structure that means nothing. Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Mpho. I see I'm back on. I was lost just for a bit there. Thank you so much. Mpho has provided us with data from another city in the country. And, the messages are to me reiterated in our focus on inequalities in the city. And these inequalities are reinforcing the challenges and vice versa. And I think the commonalities are stuck between Joburg versus Cape Town, even with what some might consider cities with very different politics. But it still seems that there's an underlying common political identity in the way that we treat the poor, or we plan around accommodation, especially for the poor. In any case, finally, let me ask Ms. Meloney van Eck to respond to the main presentation specifically. And then we will thereafter have a collective discussion on all the points and counterpoints raised by all speakers. And again, please continue writing your questions and comments in the Q&A box. And on that note, over to you, Ms. Mel, please. Can we upload a Mel slide?
All right.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you so much,
See you. Yes, great.
Yes, thank you so much, colleagues and Cyril. The observation from the two presenters was really startling. And the reason for that, for me, who's been administering the human settlement sector from a national level, is that We've got a few answers for that, but mainly the urban centers will have similarities because people migrate to it for economic opportunities. So when you look at the situation in the Western Cape and the situation in KwaZulu-Natal, as well as the situation in Gauteng, you'll find similarities because it's urban areas that are developed almost in the same way. I thought I'd start out my presentation by just giving colleagues a bit of background of what the Housing Development Agency does. And this agency is the agency that I work for. I have been in the human settlement sector as said by Prof. Cyril earlier on for quite a number of years. So I've been advantaged in a way to work in the environment where we provide solutions for the problems that we see on the ground. We might not always have the answers for everything, but we do try by all means to respond to the needs of the people on the ground. So the focus of the Housing Development Agency primarily is that we are a developer on behalf of government, and we do provide some support to municipalities and provinces in the delivery of human settlements or housing needs for South Africa. We operate in all 9 provinces, and we do this on behalf of the National Department to enhance the delivery of these services to our beneficiaries. I'm not going to go through every bullet point of what we actually do, but I just wanted to emphasize that part of our role recently and from March 2020 was also to assist with emergency housing. It's something that I've been familiar with because in my role as Deputy Director General in the Gauteng province, we have been dealing with what we deem emergency housing for various reasons. Prof. Matthew earlier on referred to the issues in the inner city of Joburg, primarily based on the evictions and the lack of housing and lack of in situ upgrading in the inner city. I think my presentation will attempt to just answer the 4 questions that we were requested to focus on. But I would like to say that from the HDA side, it's quite interesting that we have people in this field actually looking into research in the human settlement sector. I know this might not be much, but it's some considerate, like the consideration for me when I read some of these papers is how do we then have policy responses in our environment that can effectively assist with the backlog that we have in the country in terms of human settlements. Now, on this slide, I've just gone through what we were given to say, what does a home mean in the context of the urban housing crisis? It is explained. I'm going to go into the first question directly, where I'm trying to just share light on what we are trying to do in response to the problem that we have. You would have seen the 2 presenters, one focusing on Johannesburg, one on the city of Cape Town, would talk about the lack of housing and urbanization and lack of inner city redevelopment as part of the housing crisis. For us, when we looked at it, particularly when I was in Gauteng and at National, the inward migration does not stop. So whenever we do research, every year, January, we have seen trends in the Gauteng city region of inward migration. And that migration, as Prof. earlier on said, that is not limited to our citizens of South Africa, but our neighboring countries primarily come here because there's job opportunities. So what people look for is economic refuge. So whether you provide them permanent housing or not, the one thing that they want to do is to be close to job opportunities and economic opportunities. And that's what actually exacerbates our housing crisis. Now, when we looked at our rural provinces as well, and I've seen it with the crisis in the schooling environment in Gauteng in particular in January, is that people are also looking for better opportunities in terms of education. So what do? They migrate to urban centers where there is better schooling, better economic opportunities, and better access to jobs. So this inward migration actually creates an unbearable and unsustainable pressure on the limited finite resources of the province as a whole. So when you look at the cities that you guys are speaking about, it can't be spoken about in isolation of the provincial governments that they are under, as well as the national government, because the resources are shared across all three spheres of government. Now, those were two bad examples that I've made. We have quite a long list of things that we have seen through our research as well, that contributes to the crisis that we call urbanization. Now, some of our long-term solutions can't be looked at in isolation of looking at the resolution. Section 25 of the Constitution, the accessibility and ownership of land and property to the marginalized of this country. I know that Matthew, in his paper, goes extensively on about the post-apartheid era and how apartheid affected the redistribution of land. And I think the policies post-apartheid has not been effectively responsive to the plight of people. And so ownership of land makes it difficult for us to actually give adequate housing to the beneficiaries of South Africa. Now, the practical implementation of existing national strategies and programs. I think at a policy level, I must say, the NDP, the National Development Plan, the Gauteng City Region Program, the revitalization of the inner city are just but attempts to say that let's give policy direction on how we are going to respond to the crises that we have in the country. But at an implementation level, I must concede, there's quite difficulty. And I think it's because if you look at the independence of the three spheres of government, you also look at how we tend to then work in silos. And when we work in silos, we then exacerbate the problems that we're not using the resources that are supposed to complement development effectively. So in the inner city of Joburg, we've also got a problem of dilapidated infrastructure. So you can't do anything if you have not invested in upgrading that infrastructure. Most of the buildings, as articulated in the paper of Matthew, was white owned, and it was primarily for business use, isn't it? So people used to come into the city, work, and then go home. And some of the people then migrated into the city and found themselves wanting to live nearer to their places of work. And that's the infrastructure was not adequate to cater for that. You know, when we look at the rollout of affordable accommodation for the beneficiaries that resides in the inner city, we're actually looking at a couple of responses. So the city does not only have people that are working, their families or students. There's a variety and multiple beneficiaries that requires homes or human settlements responses. There are various programs designed to respond to the needs of the people in the housing environment, and this is not limited to social housing. So I think more often than not, we have been promoting social housing because it gives affordable rental. But I can tell you a story. When I was in the city of, in the province of Gauteng, I once had a problem where some of the beneficiaries of a social housing accommodation, Madula Moho, and maybe Matthew would want to look into that, was evicted. And these were families that was evicted. So when they came to our offices at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they wanted to know from us, why are we evicted? Because they did not pay the rent for a couple of months. And the owners of the SHI actually evicted them. And they wanted answers from government on how do we respond to that, because there are families that are not that are affected by this. And when you look at it, I'm saying from myself as a person that delivers these services, I had a few policy impediments that prevented me from giving them an immediate solution when I was sitting there. The situation was so dire that some of the beneficiaries or the guys that were in Joburg actually helped me and my staff, the team that I worked with, ransom and said that if we don't know where we are going to sleep tonight, then we're all going to remain in your office and sleep here. So that's the situation that we find ourselves in as civil servants as well. But as I spoke to some of the beneficiaries more often than not, and I asked them, but why did you stop to pay the rent? I saw that, you know, there's a disconnect between consumer education and the benefit, because most of them viewed the social housing or rental stock as rent to buy. They were like, Mel, but we have been staying here for more than 20 years and we've been paying and paying. We thought we now own this residence, and which was not the case, because the social housing accommodation was designed to effectively give just rental accommodation to lower income groups. And they created homes for themselves and then thought that they are free not to pay the rent. So we are faced with those evictions from time to time, and we try to assist where we can. But if you look at the inner city redevelopment, when Matthew referred to in situ development, the social housing instrument is also directed to try and do what you call in situ development. But because of the complexities of the buildings that we have to look at, if you look at the 20-story building, a 10-story building, you cannot house people while you are upgrading the infrastructure. So there are some that would argue that you can do it, but the grant that is allocated at the municipal level, at the provincial level, from national to respond to this are in direct conflict. So I'll go further to show how we work in the environment and how we derive our mandate. So there's a question that was asked: what does emergency and temporary mean when most settlements have become permanent? Yes, the transitional residential units, or TEAs, I mean, at various levels we term it different, but we do keep the first two words because it is meant to be transitional. It's meant to provide shelter whilst we are still redeveloping or providing permanent solutions for beneficiaries. And these emergencies are not limited to evictions. And that's what I actually said to my colleagues when we were looking at the paper, that it's really not limited to evictions. It's limited to, it's a variety of issues. And if you look at the matter of this morning, when you opened up and showed us that news article, those beneficiaries are really not the same beneficiaries that were there when we tried to move them. So you find yourself in a situation where you are chasing the wind. I say there are people in Alex, for instance, if you are familiar with Johannesburg as a whole, that were living on the flood lines, and we have moved those people several times. And this is how people skip what we call the housing needs register, because they see that, you know, because of the dangers that are posed by living on the floodlines, government will respond effectively very quickly to say that let's move you from here and move you to different TRUs or maybe different land parcels where you can actually stay in the interim whilst we are redeveloping Alexandra as a whole anyway. But why are we chasing the wind? That every time you relocate some beneficiaries, new beneficiaries are coming in overnight. The advent of the Grootboom case that resulted in Pi saying that, you know, when you evict, you need to provide temporary or emergency accommodation for people, has also posed several challenges for government. I must say that when we're at national, I remember Tokyo Sohwale actually saying to us that, you know, you guys must think about what your response will be, because there's an unintended consequence of legislation that is meant to protect individuals, but it actually, in fact, also inadvertently promotes the legalization of illegality, you know. So when you look at it, it's basically some of the challenges that you have, because people will go and live where they know they can be responded to much quicker by government, as opposed to living in conditions where we have to follow the course of having the normal resources that we have to respond to what we need to do. Now, this is just going further into what emergency and temporary means for us and what the intent was with our housing code and our policies that we've crafted to respond to the questions that we have. I also looked at it when COVID started, March 2020. We had to look at settlements that are actually densely populated. In the inner cities, you'd find overcrowdedness, and in certain places, there were people that were sitting there. You're right, Matthew, to say that in some instances, government really did respond much quicker. The reason why we responded much quicker is because we reprioritized the grants that was at our disposal to do the normal work in order for us to respond here. So you'll find that the backlog has not been addressed because we needed to redirect the funding that we had to address that backlog with to new priorities because we wanted to safeguard our communities and people from COVID. This is but a depiction of what we did in the city of Johannesburg. There's a settlement that was called Tent City. And these people were evicted from farms, neighboring farms around there. There were about 70 households, and they lived in dire straits. We then got a private donor that came to the HDA during COVID and said to us, you know, we are willing to assist. What can we assist with? We then said, give us a temporary alternative building technologies, and we will be able to house these people. Because with the social distancing and the conditions in which they lived, you can see from the two pictures, A and B, that the conditions was really going to exacerbate the spread of what we call the pandemic. And then we then provided this alternative technology in the form of a 30 square meter house for the residents of this particular place. Now, this is not meant to be permanent, but I can tell you, if you go in 2-3 years and we have not redeveloped that site, or we have redeveloped that site, people will start occupying that very same site again. So you'd find new beneficiaries in temporary accommodation that is meant to offload new settlements. This is also other alternative building technologies. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to go and look at our neighboring countries as well, and I was quite impressed with what they are trying to do in Rwanda in relation to the housing crisis and how they respond to it, and what they were doing in other areas. But the 2A and B is basically what we do in relation to temporary accommodation. So the temporary accommodation that we do provide, colleagues, is not just tent houses and so on. I mean, we have these shelters that we do through alternative building technologies, and that's about it. So what are the practical, how many minutes?
We close maybe 3 minutes. I can give you 2 minutes to try and wrap.
Please give me 3. Okay. The first practical obstacle is, like I reiterated, was the accessibility of land. The second was the fact that there's outdated legislation. And I'm happy that people are doing research in this area, because it will just help us with a policy direction and trying to influence legislation at all 3 spheres so that we can then effectively respond. But one of the things that we didn't look at is the political obstacles. And that, Cyril, is primarily us not having been prepared for coalition governments and what the changes means to service delivery. So here I'm trying to just demonstrate that the changes in the city of Johannesburg has also meant changes in the delivery of services because of the way that people budget. They look for their constituencies and they look to deliver where they got their votes. In the absence of a definition of a home, I'm trying to depict what we as government has said human settlements is for us. But if you look at the social starting point, you have to locate a home in the context of where you live must be where you socialize, where you pray, where you worship, where you entertain, and where you work. So they must not be far from economic centers, because pre-apartheid, when people moved from Soweto to Joburg, their salaries were absorbed by what? Transportation. So that's what we're trying to do with the response to human settlements. When we talk about emotional, for me, a home should not only be seen as providing shelter, but it encompasses all the emotional aspects. In most instances in my field of work, I've seen when we want to move people from the temporary accommodation that we've given them, they then say to you, but I've built a community here, I've lived here, my kids are comfortable here. And that's how it also becomes permanent residences for them. Political, people are ultimately, communities are complete when they are able to be with themselves and in order to achieve their basic social needs. I think I'll pause there. Thank you for the opportunity to participate, Cyril. And I think we'd appreciate more discussions on the housing crisis because we don't have all the answers. And I think by having these discussions, we'll be able to talk to one another. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ms. Meloney van Eck. Mel, thank you there. Colleagues, many issues, proposals, etc. I'm just even thinking, you know, is a home even a physical space? After all of these discussions, a friend once told me that, you know, the home or a home is where where one's accent is. I think what they meant was that the way that you speak reveals your idea of home or your identity. So excuse me. So Mel spoke about people having formed communities and not wanting to move. So in that sense, I think a home could be a community with shared values in both urban and rural spaces. For migrant workers, are we home in the cities and working for the home back home? How do all this data and all these ideas presented go into possible solutions, whether these solutions come from government or whether they come from activists or academics? But the time, colleagues, is now for your participation, your questions, your comments, and we'll go to the questions in a sequence that they were posted. I'll try and give everybody a chance. I see there are a number of questions. I'll try to get through all of them if possible, but to give everybody a chance, I'll just give one person a question in the first round and see how it goes. Which then means that I'll start off with the first question that came first was from Dumsane Hompashe. Dumsane is at Forte. And he writes and is asking Matthew, because we've got a high number of questions, I'm going to have to go through by reading this to save time. He says, Dumsani, thank you for this important topic. Can you comment, this is for Matthew, can you comment on housing allocation? What is your take on possible involvement of politicians on the allocation of houses? There are instances where people who need houses are in the waiting list for years without getting their houses. How can these problems be tackled? I think maybe I can go through questions. How do you prefer, colleagues? Should I read out maybe 3 questions at a time and everybody's given a response, or one question at a time? Matthew?
3 questions would be fine, Cyril.
Sorry, say that again.
I'm saying 3 questions would be fine because in the same time you can respond.
Oh, okay, fantastic. Okay, so there was a question there specifically for Matthew, but I see Siyabonga also asked a question for Matthew. Matthew, he writes, does section 26, subsection 3 protect the unlawful occupier and also their undisturbed occupation? That's a question. And then he has got another question there, but maybe, yeah, that would be the last question from Siyabonga. Do you see local municipalities perform their constitutional duties when it comes to housing? So those are two questions, one from Dumsani, one from Siyabonga, and then a third question is also for Matthew. I think it's from Martin. Martin Gustafsson writes, thank you, Matthew, for an informative presentation. Building grassroots democratic structures to protect residents against abuse of the kind you described is an obvious solution. But if such structures threaten vested interests, be they criminals, business, or the state, these structures will face pushback. In the Joburg context, what are some of the hurdles local activists face? Is it right to even think of grassroots activist groups as homogeneous? Okay, I'll stop there. Most of those questions to be directed to you, Matthew. Over to you.
Hi, can you hear me? Sorry, I'm coming in through my phone because my internet cut. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfectly.
So thanks so much. And thanks to both Mpho and Mal for very fascinating discussions. And I think it's really valuable to, to have these different perspectives also for the listeners, to also understand the kind of constraints and logics that the state, lawyers, activists, and academics are working from. And so I have a couple of responses to those. I'll respond more immediately to the question on allocation. I mean, I think it's one hard to answer because it's both a political issue of how one allocates, and there's also the kind of technical issue. One thing I think we shouldn't conflate is also, I think Meloney spoke a bit about the kind of lists, but many people are waiting for self-owned RDP or breaking new ground houses. And those lists often get conflated with the lists for rental accommodation, and they're not the same thing, because somebody waiting for a kind of state subsidized or RDP house, it may not be the same person who wants to pay for rental accommodation, and we're not even talking about free accommodation. We're just talking about at a rental that inner city residents can afford. And if you look at like the city of Joburg's ID development plan for last year, even they acknowledge that the lists are really conflated. There are a whole lot of things being conflated at once. So, I mean, there's a technical issue just on the list system, and related to Meloney's point. I mean, I found really fascinating. So thank you, but I really question whether this idea that seeing an unlawful occupation and somehow jumping the list is feasible. Just if you look at the time frame of legal cases, like some of these legal cases go on for 7, 8, sometimes 10 years. It's not a very effective way of jumping a list when you might both threaten with eviction, but you might also. Now, I can't deny that you may have had experience with that. Certainly, I've not once come across a person in the city who's said that was the motivation for an unlawful occupation. There are many different motivations, and as I say, some people were living there and it went into unlawful rental, like the case with Madula Moho and so on. So I think we at least need to hold that up and have some kind of, and maybe it's a research topic, more grounded evidence for whether that is or not, because it's not in my space. And again, there's the question. I think the allocation is linked to the allocation of housing. Again, my argument has never been that, say, for instance, asylum seekers should have access to permanent housing. Maybe those with refugee status or permanent residence. My argument has been that they should have access to subsidized rental housing, and so one has to distinguish these, because one is a permanent right, the other is more temporary. And I know there are issues of allocation and pressures. And so these are, again, I think, yes, politicians should be involved, but they should also be democratic processes, of how cities and municipalities prioritize, establish implementation and so on. And so I guess I'm coming back to my basic point, is that there have to be really democratic engagement around how decision-making is met. So it doesn't lead to a state, a situation where politicians or locally connected ward councils or elites or whoever are then allocating people who are connected to them. I mean, that's a very dangerous situation. It has to, there has to be transparency. And I think often there's not. But that's a very in-depth. Siyabonga, who I spoke about, Nhlanhla, General Secretary of Inner City Federation, I mean, he knows these in much more detail than I do, in fact, the legal issues. I mean, he raised the issue of, do you see local municipalities performing their constitutional duties? Well, I think in part there was a response to Blue Moonlight in terms of the development of the inner city housing plan. Under Tau and the expansion of often it's been under court pressure, and the implementation is another question. You know, I mean, in a city housing plan, which aimed to expand, I think, you know, 9,500 units, I think was good, although it maybe didn't cater enough for lower levels. But nonetheless, from what I can see, the implementation has been nowhere close to what was planned. And again, there needs to be a proper review of what's actually been done, because I haven't been able to find the actual figures for how many houses have been built. But I think it goes deeper again than simply a kind of a technical issue. But what is the spirit of the Constitution, which is also to create a sense of dignified living for inner city residents. And that again, as Siyabonga knows very well, and Sia and others has been struggling for, is about getting the municipality to take them serious as residents of the city and engage. And I don't know if we have any time. It might be interesting for Sia to give his perspective on that. I mean, I'll leave it there, because there's very dense, and also to open to the other participants if they want to kind of answer on those.
Matthew, do you want to say something to Martin's a question there? I see that Jamie has shared it with you. Should I repeat it? And then that would be, the question, last question in this round.
On the context, hurdles local activists face. Nhlanhla, is it possible to let Siyabonga speak? Because I mean, he's one of the leaders of these, and he could speak more directly than I can.
Yes, I will do that. Let's just wrap this round, and then I'll put him on. Is that okay? Okay.
So I mean, briefly, I think that there are movements which, like Inner City Federation, which have developed, and certainly in Cape Town, as Mpho has spoken about, Ndifuna Ukwazi, Reclaim the City, which I think are attempting to mobilize in very difficult urban environments, which are complex. And I think a major obstacle is the municipalities not really taking them seriously and seeing them as criminal elements or legal opposition, and not actually having a serious engagement. But I'd be interested to hear the other perspectives.
Okay, are we able to put Siyabonga on there, Tamrin?
He is on. Siyabonga, you're able to speak?
So, Sia, I mean, maybe you could speak to this question of the hurdles or the difficulties local activists are facing.
Okay. The reason why I asked that question of does Matthew see any action that are being taken by any cities or local municipalities, just that I've been running around. I just realized that I'm not sure I'm the only one who sees that they are not acting proactive when it comes to basic services and housing allocation. I remember one day when I was called at Madam Speaker at ENCA with Katle Jana from HDA. They told us that they've been delivering so many houses around the cities. But those houses, we don't see them. We only heard that there are those houses. And I also heard that Melon says that cover even those who are unemployed, which is something that we didn't see. And also Matthew touches the I-chip. The I-chip was clearly stating that most of the people who are residing around the inner city of Johannesburg, they are unemployed, but they were not covered in that I-chip. The only people that they were covered, they were people from earning 1,500 upward. So to me, I don't see any action from the government, or I don't see our local municipalities acting proactive when it comes to providing basic services or providing houses. As Mpho also mentions that in the city of Cape Town, they don't see such things. Whenever you want to see those things happening, you have to go to court and litigate on that and say, here's the litigation that we sing. to have in front of the judge. So whenever they have to be always abided by the court, they don't perform their duties just as it's supposed to be. It is stated in the Constitution of South Africa that they say they have to intervene in any stages when people they need those help. But for them to intervene, you have to go to court, do all those things. But they know that those poor people, they don't have got all means and resources to approach the court so that they can be heard and be assisted by the government. That's what I can say on that. Those are my comments.
And Siyabonga, what do you think about the dynamics within the grassroots activist structures? Do you think of those as homogeneous? What are the issues faced there, do you think?
All the activists, they are facing the similar issues, because whenever they go and try to negotiate, sometimes they will be tendered away. Sometimes they will be kept with empty promises, then say, look, go back, we are coming to take the grievances of the community, or we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this particular days, but only to find out those things are not happening. What I can say is that the activists, they've got the workload that they can't reload from their shoulders without involving legal firms to assist.
Mpho, on your side, your perspective on this question, also because you work lots on the ground.
All right. I wouldn't say I work extensively on the ground, but we do have a good relationship with our social movement partner, Reclaim the City, and others across the metro. And what we see there, especially in the Cape Town context, you can't really view such groupings as homogeneous, unfortunately. As I said in my presentation, there's an extremely racialized element to the Cape Town perspective. And that plays out also in how people organize and how they identify with each other. But Reclaim the City in particular strives to unite particularly the two groupings, which are Black and colored people who find themselves dispossessed of land and unable to access adequate housing in the inner city and surrounds. So there we see a situation where a common cause tends to unite people despite their diverse backgrounds against the perceived enemy, which is the city, which, as Matthew pointed to, does not recognize such individuals, does not even recognize the need that needs to be addressed. Instead, it tends to see it as a political impediment or some sort of criminal element that needs to be dealt with through the criminal system. But we've seen in recent times, they are now stating that they are wanting to build social housing, specifically on the sites that have been occupied by the social movement. Now, again, polarizing the society in Cape Town, trying to paint a picture of the occupiers now being an impediment to the social housing that the occupiers themselves have been calling for a number of years. So more recently, we've seen this about turn in the attitude of the city. And while we are suspicious of how genuine this want to be an inclusive city that brings in the poor to the centers of economic opportunity, we also realize that it is an election year and politics and land are very emotive subjects that can be utilized to sway particular opinions.
Sure. Mel, any of the comments, questions there that you would like to respond to?
Yes, thank you so much, Cyril. I really would like to maybe just shed a bit of light on the responses of government. There is never an instance where we're only waiting for court outcomes in order for us to respond as government to the needs of the people. And I'm going to make two bad examples. In the city of Cape Town recently, there was fires of shacks in Masipumele, in Taiwan. You know, we responded as government, and in particular as the HDA, very quickly to that. We didn't need a pronouncement from court to do so. So and on the issue of the needs register, the needs register does not look for beneficiaries for RDP homes only. So the HDA is not a developer that only focuses on giving RDPs with people that does not earn anything between 0 and 3,005. We actually have various housing instruments that we respond to beneficiaries with. And the social housing aspect is but one of them. So there's a social housing agency called Shara that deals with that. We've got NHFC that deals with middle and lower income levels, people who are deemed too rich by us to benefit from an RDP, but too poor by the banks to benefit from a bond. There's certain instruments that we have, like the likes of FLISP and so on, that we do respond with. So we're not waiting for court outcomes in order for us to respond. I made an example to say the Grootboom matter actually made us think quite a lot of what our response mechanisms would be. So I'm fortunate to have worked in the environment, and we do have social partners. When we had to respond to the issue of COVID, the HDA was the champion of government in the response to trying to provide shelters that are adequate for people not to spread the pandemic. And when we did that, we actually had social partners. And I would really like to invite Siyabonga and some of the partners that say that they do not know to come to us so that we can show you, because it will be a learning experience for both parties. We can learn from where your perspective, what is it that you don't see, or what is it that we don't do. But I'm open to actually arranging for some of the participants so that we don't do selective research, but our response must be holistic to what we want to achieve as a nation. I mean, our social partners often do criticize us, and we do have members of the academia as well. We work a lot with Rhodes, we work a lot with Stellenbosch as well. We work a lot with Nelson Mandela University, and just for us to get inputs on how to respond to certain things. And fortunately, as an agency of the National Department, we are able to do that holistically. Thank you, Cyril. I thought I should just say that.
Okay. Formally, colleagues in the audience and on the panel, we've got only 2 minutes. So I can just, what I think I probably need to do is to just do the formalities in terms of directing people to the ISER YouTube channel. That's where you can find the recording of this discussion. But we will continue on our side if you have to go. Those who can stay on, and we can tackle maybe say 10 to 15 minutes. Matthew, what do you think? And those who can go can leave?
That's fine for me. I'd appreciate that.
Okay, fantastic. And Mel and Mpho, on your side, how are you for time? Can we push it for, say, 10 to 15 minutes?
I'm fine. Thank you, Cyril.
Ooh, okay. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave.
To go. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Mpho, for joining us. Really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll connect. Thank you there. All right. Let me go on then to some of the questions there. Lauren said, thanks, Mpho. I'm Lauren Rhodes. I hope Mpho will check this out later on. We'll send it to her. I'm going to have to leave soon, but wanted to add to the conversation. We've developed a national framework for alternative accommodation and a policy brief on alternative accommodation primarily directed at municipalities. Okay, that's a sharing of information there from Lauren. Otherwise, thanks for useful insights, Mpho and Matthew. she says there. And then a person who hasn't spoken is, we haven't took their question or comment, is Philip Nyalungu. Isn't that RDP was scrapped in 1996 for a corporation like HDA to make a profit that most people can't afford because of outright unemployment, poverty, and informalization of work? I think that is a comment or question directed at you, Mel. I'm hoping you can understand. Can you follow? Do you think you can respond? Or should I ask Philip to come on board?
Maybe you can ask him to come on board, because I don't know if he's referring to the RDP policy, or does he just want to talk about the housing aspect? Because remember, post 1994, there was a macroeconomic policy called the RDP. Yeah. So can we just?
Philip, are you able? We able to get Philip? Is he still with us?
I don't think he's still with us, Prof. I'm not finding him in the attendees.
In the attendees, okay. So let's go to Lindy Koza then. This is so true, Melanie. And what type of provision and or commitment from human settlements beneficiaries to make sure that they also take full responsibility in making sure that they contribute part in the housing process? I think that one, Mel, are you able to respond there?
It sounded like a comment, Cyril, so I didn't want to unnecessarily taint it if it's not a question.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, Pedro, my hand has been up. I'm not sure if nobody can see it because it's dark. Is Pedro in the audience? Pedro, do you want to ask your question live? We will probably be the last person that we do that with. Is Pedro there, Tamrin?
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm glad my hand has now been up. And thank you so much, colleagues, for the wonderful inputs throughout the day. Maybe mine is a last comment. I think we've got to historicize the city in Africa. It's the site of colonial geography and the exploitative economy of Euro-American extraction. In other words, beyond the African city being the symbol of material exclusion, it is by and large an exclusive space that resembles the racist tranquility of European cities, so that those who identify themselves as white and European get to feel at home, whether they are in London or Cape Town. That is why, therefore, cities anchor their social and economic landscape on the framework of private property, where space, land, and movement are all tabled as commodities that the upper class must generate its resources from, So the city in this regard is not concerned about the working class, the poor, and the Black majority, because it was not conceptualized to be a public good that provides a residential and a sustainable space for groups such as workers and students. So the continuous work of trying to study how capitalism and colonialism converged in the generation of the African city is what is going to equip us with the right language to understand the racist, geographic, gendered, and class-orientated forces of power that generate these realities we face in our time. So,
okay, so what is your question?
So if we do that kind of critical work in city studies in Africa, I think we'll begin to formulate alternative concepts that go beyond looking at these issues as mere urbanization issues or local government failures or lack of water and so on. That's just my contribution, Chair. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much.
So I can,
Matthew?
So yeah, I mean, thanks for that point, and it linked also to response that to what Melanie had said about migration is, I mean, if we look at the kind of landscape of apartheid and colonial geography, I mean, migration into the cities has often been for mining. It's been often focused around the exploitation of black labor, and Johannesburg, since its origins, has been characterized by these patterns of inward migration and the exclusion of black working class. And that inward migration is linked to not just the city structure, but the regional structure of where, how capital exploitation has worked, with Johannesburg being in particular the locus of regional wealth. So that migration into the city has always been the case, and it will continue. And particularly with the climate crisis, in which we are heading into in a real way, and with the regional drought, which studies have showed is linked to anthropogenic change, that is not going to go away. And no amount of securitization of our borders or policing is going to change that dynamic. So we can, in terms of the inward migration to the cities, we can either see, well, this is a feature which is in fact probably going to intensify with the climate crisis, or we see, there are regional political issues around inequality and stability, which, I'm not the expert to address. But I think we have to really think about that inward migration as a feature of the city, and how do you address that in a way which doesn't lead to the continual exclusion of the black working class. And this is a very serious issue. I mean, no single person can answer. I'm going to say two things just in response while I'm speaking, because I know time is short. The one is, I think that we have to look at these things both in terms of both the politics and structural issues, but also in terms of the technical issues. And Meloney has helped clarify some of those for me, which is very valuable. And I think also very valuable for HDA and her to engage with Inner City Federation, people like Sia, because I think academics, we can speak about issues, but we don't represent these populations and these groups. And it's very important that direct democratic engagement. The second thing, just on a technical issue, which is one point of in situ upgrading. I mean, it is potentially technically feasible. There's a group, for instance, One-to-One Agency, which is a group of young architects in Johannesburg who've been working on models for how you can do in situ upgrading of buildings by constructing, say, temporary sites. You do it on a floor-by-floor basis, and you renovate where people move out on a temporary basis and move back in. So it's technically difficult, but not impossible. I can't answer that, but there are architects working on that. There are also precedents for this. I'm speaking from Brazil in Sao Paulo during the Workers' Party rule, where the city council actually bought occupations or attempted to buy occupations for the occupiers and worked with the occupiers and social movements on both upgrading the buildings they were living in, but also providing other accommodations. So there are precedents of city governments working in a very different way around these issues. And so that is, one solution. Now, I'm not saying any of these are easy, but I think if there's political will to think outside of the framework that people must just be relocated, there are ways to chart forward and think of innovative ways to respond to these issues.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Mel, I'll give you an opportunity to be the last speaker, and then I close. If you've got anything to add, yeah.
Thank you, Cyril. And thank you, Matthew, and thank you for the participants as well. This was really very informative for us as the HDA as well. We're open to discussions with social partners and people who can contribute towards us trying to alleviate this housing backlog that we have. We do want to re-emerge in the urban spaces, and I think that's very important for us as an organization. And we want to see a future where a home is self-sustaining. One thing that I've realized, and maybe it's part of the research that we've done through my work, is that in certain instances, when you give a home to a person, and I always say it to the team, you give a liability. Because there are beneficiaries that would say that I would rather have a job than have a house that requires for me to pay municipal bills, to start furnishing it, and I'm unemployed. How do I then do that? It's an additional burden on the state again, because you then need to lower the contribution from that particular beneficiary and try all sorts of mechanisms of cross-subsidization. Yes, the inner city does have the potential to be revitalized, or we can try piloting what you call in situ upgrading, Matthew. The only worry that we have, and we are going to try that with a building that we've recently acquired 2 weeks ago. It was an Eskom building in Braamfontein. Our views are, and we're just testing the structural integrity of that particular building, that we can turn that into student accommodation. Obviously, we will then derive rental from that can cross-subsidize some of the other programs that we run within the HDA. But we want to be sure that it's structurally sound and it is indeed effective for us to respond to the needs. We got it at a cheap price because it was a building belonging to another state-owned entity, Eskom, but it was a building that was used for office accommodation. Yet again, we need to upgrade the infrastructure for that building in order for us to respond to the housing crisis. Colleagues, I would really say that the HDA is open to engagement, we are open to learning, and we're also open to showing what we are doing. We're not focusing on only beneficiaries for RDP housing. We are looking at what the housing needs are in South Africa and as government, what our response mechanism should be, and how we partner with private partners as well to respond to that. Thank you, Cyril. Thank you, Matthew.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you very much, and to everyone who has contributed.
Thank you. Colleagues, thank you for joining us. You'll find the recording of the webinar on ISER YouTube and channel and other social media platforms tomorrow at the latest. Where comments, questions are also welcome, and this discussion can continue on those. We have to thank you for taking the time to join us, and ask that you join us again at our future seminars. Specifically thank Matthew, Mpho, and Meloney for stimulating a great discussion and providing possible directions on where we should or could be going, and maybe where we should not be going faced with these challenges. I also thank the whole ICR team for putting together this important webinar. Please don't forget our webpage, ru.ac.za/ICR. Yeah, have a great day further, and thank you so much for having joined us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.